Welcome to the History Guy Podcast, a podcast dedicated to stories of lesser-known historical events told by Lance Geiger, also known as the History Guy on YouTube. I'm Josh, your host, a writer for the channel and eldest son of the History Guy. We tell all kinds of stories about history from the modern era to the ancient past, so you never know what we're going to talk about next. One thing you can be sure of, it is history that deserves to be remembered. We at the History Guy are also excited to announce a new way to interact with the team and the History Guy himself at locals.com. Join the History Guy Guild for your one-stop location to chat with other history fans, get updates on the team, and more. You can join for free or pay as little as $5 a month to get access to live chats with the History Guy, looks behind the scenes, early access to ad-free videos, and more. Find us at historyguyguild.locals.com. We look forward to seeing you there. On today's episode, the History Guy talks about two Cold War programs meant to protect the United States and North America from the threat of nuclear war. First, the History Guy tells the story of the distant early warning line and its predecessors, radar systems meant to track possible attacks over the Arctic Circle. Then the History Guy tells the story of the Texas Towers and the tragedy that befell the men on Texas Tower 4. Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
Large public works, from ancient pyramids to modern superhighways, have transformed the world. And while these projects are amazing in their own right, they often have unintended consequences that go far beyond the original scope of the project. And that is particularly true of one massive public works project that occurred in the middle of the 1950s. Between February of 1954 and July of 1957, the United States and Canadian governments cooperated on one of the largest and most ambitious construction projects in the history of the world. And in doing so, they transformed Canada. They changed its culture, its economy, its governance, its very geography. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The realities of the Second World War first brought the U.S. and Canada to the realization that we had much to gain by mutual military cooperation. The early risk that England may fall to Nazi Germany suggested that Canada, with its vast natural resources and a relatively small population, might be the next target. Officials in both the United States and Canada recognized the value of joint cooperation in defense of the continent. In August of 1940, Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King and U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Ogdensburg Agreement, which created the Permanent Joint Board on Defense. The board includes both Canadian and American military and civilian representatives, with the task of providing policy-level consultation on bilateral defense matters. The existence of the Joint Board positioned the countries for further cooperation during the tense times of the Cold War, as both nations became concerned about continental defense, or the protection of North America from the threat of attack by long-range bombers. The obvious idea was to build a line of radar installations that could detect incoming bombers early, giving time to direct fighter aircraft to attack the bomber formations. But both nations were also facing a public demand to reduce defense spending and increasing demands to meet their NATO commitments in Europe. And radar technology at the time had its limitations. It was expensive. It was relatively short-ranged. It required large support teams. And if you put your radar installations farther out on the frontier where they could detect Soviet bombers earlier, that magnified the difficulty of building and maintaining such installations. Plans for a joint early warning system started as early as 1946, but it took the first Soviet test of a nuclear bomb, called First Lightning, August 29th of 1949, to finally compel the U.S. Congress to appropriate funds. The first continental radar defense line was called the Pine Tree Line. The joint project was constructed around the 50th parallel, under the philosophy that a Soviet attack would likely center on major population and industrial centers. But even as it became operational in 1954, it was, in many ways, outdated. The line used classic pulsed mode radar, which was relatively short-ranged, imprecise, and often unable to detect objects flying close to the ground. Additionally, the location of the stations close to the population centers they were protecting provided only limited warning time. While parts of the Pine Tree Line remained in service into the 1990s, it was clear from the beginning that the Pine Tree Line would provide insufficient protection from bomber attack. In 1956, construction began on a new line of radar stations across the 55th parallel. This line used newer forward scattered bistatic radar technology with greater range and automation. The so-called Mid-Canada Line was seen more as a supplement for the Pine Tree Line than a replacement, and unlike the Pine Tree Line, was wholly funded by Canada and staffed by Royal Canadian Air Force personnel. But despite the new technology, the Mid-Canada Line also had technological limitations. While the bistatic radar technology meant that the radar could detect to higher altitudes and longer ranges, it was not able to determine exact locations, and as such was more of a tripwire than a useful tool for vectoring fighter interceptors. Just as problematic, the radar signal could be overwhelmed by flocks of birds during migration season. Like the Pine Tree Line, the Mid-Canada Line was largely outdated before it was operational, and another, more capable line was being planned, even as the Mid-Canada Line was being constructed. The final line was, by far, the most capable, utilizing newer technologies and placed much farther towards the North Pole, as the pole was the shortest route that Soviet bombers would take if attacking into North America. While improved radar technology and automation made it more practical to staff a line so far north, the Distant Early Warning Line, or DEW line, was nonetheless an ambitious feat of engineering. It planned to take some of the world's most advanced technologies and place them into some of the world's most remote and inhospitable environments. The DEW line would be placed along the 69th parallel, 200 to 300 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle. The DEW line stations included two types of radar. The long-range detection system had two back-to-back antennas, one with a pencil beam for long-range precision detection, and one with a square beam for general search with a wider beam. Those antennas would be flanked by shorter-ranged bistatic gap-filler radars, which would detect any aircraft trying to sneak between the long-range radar. That system was similar to the one that was used on the Mid-Canada Line, but used the Doppler effect, which allowed it to filter out slow-moving objects and avoid the issues with migrating birds blocking the radar. The two systems provided a more comprehensive barrier than the previous two echelons, and location at the edge of the Arctic offered far greater warning of an attack, allowing better time to plan and ready both defensive interceptors and strategic bombers that would allow counterattack. The stations were connected to each other and command and control through a communication network called the White Alice Communication System, or WACS, that required large parabolic antennas. Because of the remoteness and inaccessibility of the locations, the stations needed to be designed for both self-sufficiency and for mutual support. Designs had to include extensive port storage facilities, repair and maintenance capabilities, and multiple system redundancies. Merely doing the survey to identify the 63 sites that stretched from Alaska to the Baffin Islands was an epic feat. There was no infrastructure in the north of Canada. Survey teams operated in primitive conditions and extreme weather to try to identify locations that you could access via water for construction and resupply, that had room for airfields, that had ground where you could build an installation, or if not, enough gravel nearby that they could literally build ground to build an installation, and of course, most importantly, that had an unobstructed radar view to the north. The construction process was massive, involving some 25,000 people. 3,000 members of the U.S. Army Transportation Corps managed the sea lift during the brief summers. Materials were airlifted by massive U.S. Air Force ski-equipped Lockheed LC-130s, as well as Douglas C-124 Globemasters and Fairchild C-119 flying boxcars. The rugged conditions for construction and supply created a market for short takeoff and landing bush planes, like the de Havilland Canada DHC-2 Beaver. Whatever could not be moved by plane or boat would be dragged in cat trains of sledges dragged by snowcats and bulldozers. In all, some 460,000 tons of material was moved from the U.S. and southern Canada to the Arctic in some of the most difficult-to-reach locations and brutal weather conditions on Earth. Subcontractors then used thousands of workers to transform those into bases, building housing, airstrips, aircraft hangars, outdoor and covered antennas, and antenna towers, often in the dark and in sub-zero temperatures. Despite the challenges, the line was constructed quickly, and in 1957, 2 years and 8 months after the decision to build was made, the line was operational. The 63 stations came in different sizes. Some were unmanned and only required maintenance during the brief summers. Others had crews of just 3 people. Larger stations might have as many as 100 personnel. All those people so far up north that in the dead of winter, the temperature outside might be as low as minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The construction and operation in what was previously an almost completely undeveloped part of the world did offer some economic and scientific benefits. Small bush plane operations that got supply contracts got so much business that they grew to major airlines, with both Canadian Airlines and Eastern Provincial Airlines deriving from such operations. Likewise, Canadian electronic contractors with supply contracts gained substantial business and grew as an industry. The DEW line provided opportunities for research and scientific development. The experience of the construction provided valuable insights into building and maintaining materials and bases in remote locations and extreme environments. And the stations offered an unprecedented opportunity for the study of Arctic weather and oceanographic study. But the DEW line also offered unique challenges in environmental impacts. Building and maintaining the stations required roads that cut through the permafrost, damaging watersheds and wildlife migration routes. As the bases required significant storage due to the difficulty of resupply, they had many tanks, both above and below ground, with which time have leaked millions of gallons of fuel and dangerous chemicals. A Canadian project to remediate the environmental damage from 21 dew line sites that were decommissioned in the 1960s, conducted between 1996 and 2014, was the largest environmental cleanup in Canadian history and cost $575 million. The scope of the project was staggering, with hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of contaminated soils and debris. Some soil was so contaminated that it had to be removed to facilities in the south. Others were buried in specifically constructed landfills. But one of the most significant effects of the manufacture of the line was on Canadian culture and the native peoples of Canada's north. While there was a concern about the effect on these remote populations from the start, Canada appointed Northern Resource Officers to represent their interest. The impact on culture proved to be beyond management. While it offered a pipeline of government services to populations which previously had been largely ignored, and offered economic, educational, and healthcare opportunities that were barely existent previously, dew line operations also had an irreparable impact on the hunter-gatherer peoples of Canada's north. As one Canadian university professor noted, in all of recorded human history, there is no group of people who went from hunting and gathering culture to a modern one in such a short period of time. The resulting upheaval left the Inuit with deep social scars, and the concurrent risks of a new sedentary wage economy, including new health risks and challenges like alcohol-related violence. Like the Pine Tree Line and the Mid-Canada Line, the Dew Line, one of the most ambitious construction projects in world history, was largely outdated before it was even completed. The advent of nuclear missiles made these sites that detected only incoming bombers less important. In 1985, the United States and Canada came to an agreement to dismantle the Dew Line. Some stations were upgraded with better radar, other stations were simply decommissioned, and the last official Dew Line station was decommissioned in 1993. What is left is now called the North Warning System, and unlike the Dew Line, those stations that are in Canada are manned exclusively by Canadian personnel, while the United States mans those stations that are in the United States and helps to fund the entire system. The project was extraordinary in its scope. It was a marvel of its time, and it was part of that system that purports to have prevented nuclear Armageddon via mutual deterrence. But like every great project, it had implications far beyond its intent, and it transformed the north of Canada, both physically and culturally. And it might have offered lessons that will be useful in the future as the world faces new challenges. It is history that deserves to be remembered.
Now is the part of the episode where we get to chat with the history guy. A little bit about what we just heard, what we're going to hear, and some behind-the-scenes stuff that you only get to hear about on the podcast. We also have a special guest today. She's been on the podcast a few times before, and it's Betty Jo, the history guy's mom, and of course my grandmother. The scale of these projects, of like the Dew Line and even the lines that came before it, and you pointed out at the beginning of the video, is enormous. I mean, it was incredible that they were putting this stuff together. Even when you start at the Pine Tree Line, when we were talking about covering so much space and making sure that we had radar contacts across that entire section of space. What kind of made these lines, these lines of radar technology, what was vital about them that made them want to, pay those costs?
Well, I mean, at the time, and of course, you can go back and rethink the Cold War all you want about, how much ill will either of us really had for the other. Each always sounded surprised at the suggestion that they would be the aggressor. But at the time, I mean, we legitimately thought that there was a chance that those darn Ruskies were going to come drop atomic bombs on us. And so these determined how far out we would know that could occur in order to respond. And so the thinking, when you start thinking mutually assured destruction, then you start getting into each other's heads about how can you do some sort of first decapitating strike that would prevent that, and then you think that you could do that for self-defense, and then you're thinking in terms of how do we keep that from something that could happen. So when you put all the pieces of it together, I mean, we really thought we might be protecting the existence of civilization, the existence of not just our world but the world, because these detection mechanisms are what guaranteed mutually assured destruction, which is what kept us from nuking each other out of existence. So I think when you understand the reasoning at the time that we really literally thought that life on Earth depended upon this, you can see how we put the effort into it. But the other thing to note is this is shortly after the Second World War. And we're on a war footing. We're on a belief that we can afford to do almost anything. I mean, look at the fleets that we built and the airplanes that we built and the technology that developed. And that's combined at the same time that I think we are just as paranoid about us starting. When the U.S. entered World War II, we knew we were unprepared, and I think we left World War II saying that we're the biggest power in the world, and we are never going to be unprepared again. So you've got that same sort of we're willing to sacrifice for a war footing, put together with the we honestly think that the world is at stake, and we could go do incredible things. And it's hard to imagine. You can't really rethink, but it's hard to imagine if we had applied that effort otherwise. What might it have meant? And you get all these arguments. Eisenhower talked about the military-industrial complex at the time too, as well. There was just an argument that says that we've got to keep defense spending because if a war starts, we don't have time to ramp up again, and so let's just keep buying stuff.
And I have a question, and I don't know when you researched it, when you were doing that. Did the Russians do the same thing? Did they set up lines and defense lines?
Yes. There's relatively less information on it, but the Russians were doing the same thing. They were, and there are stories, just like with ours, of the Russian lines, having false positives that could have led to a nuclear confrontation. So I haven't done any episodes on the Russian versions. There's a lot less known about them. But yes, we were both very much concerned with early warning. And it's interesting, we talk about the Russians have had a space force for decades. Their space force, what the Russians call space force, whose emblem actually looks a lot like our space force emblem. Their space force is the guys that watch the early warning systems. But yeah, there's these massive radars that are built in Europe, and that was all part of the Soviet system. Yeah. And
I'll tell you what, when you talk about was it serious or not, and we've talked about that this week with Lance and I have, and that's the fact that, we sat under our desk. We did it often. We like they do the drills now in the schools. But I try to think if I believed it or not. If I really thought that was that might happen to us, and I don't think I did. But it was certainly a part of my upbringing and part of my school all those years. Anybody of an age remembers the fact that the sirens go off and we'd climb under our desk. And I don't know how much good that desk would have done us, but it is an interesting question.
That can literally suggest covering yourself with a newspaper.
Yeah, it does seem difficult to imagine that was actually going to protect you if you were really at all close enough to a nuclear blast, that you were going to want to take cover. Taking cover was going to do much good. They've talked about how at least you're doing something then.
That's true. Well,
keeps you from thinking about the hopelessness.
We can't be caught with a mine shaft gap.
It's really kind of incredible how much that is, that's just like kind of the regular stuff that I think that a lot of people, they don't talk about it in the history books. Although we talk about a lot of the ducking under desks and stuff. It's still some of that kind of stuff that everybody experienced. And so it feels like something everybody knows. And I wonder, that's the kind of stuff that I think falls by the wayside sometimes. And 100 years from now, it's not going to be as well remembered.
I didn't do duck and cover. We didn't see duck under our desk. We missed that piece. So and obviously you were well past that piece. Now you're wondering, the way the world's going, if we need to be giving people. Well, they recently made a video in New York. I guess the New York emergency people did a video on what to do in case of a nuclear war, which was. So, go inside. So maybe we're talking about it again. Maybe we'll start making new crackers. And
we certainly don't seem, at the time, you would think we had at least a lot of systems in place for if there was an attack. And these days, there's not really, we've got various disaster situations, but it's not like everybody knows where the nearest shelter is, or at least I don't know where the nearest shelter is.
We don't have air raid wardens anymore.
Yeah.
It used to be like they divided the nation up. There were 100 blocks, and you were going to have one senior warden, and you're going to have 10 wardens, and everybody. We just don't have that anymore. But the facilities aren't kept up anymore. You might still see those signs, but if your local high school gym is set up as a civil defense shelter, probably has very little in terms of supply. And I'm sure the thinking now is more in terms of natural disaster than nuclear war.
Well, but the other thing is, and I don't know that we're that much better communications and such, but how many of us really believe that sitting in our desk or going into an air raid shelter is really going to protect you?
Make a difference, yeah.
If they start shooting off the nuclear bombs, I think most of the world realizes this is for serious, and you even wonder, do if you had a choice, do you want to be the last one
The
left?
last one here. Well, and was it ever
Yeah,
real, or was
that's-
it just a way to make people feel some sense of security, or they could do something about it, or I honestly don't know. I mean, we're reaching a new era where there's new dangers, and there's always been these discussions that something like low intensity conflict, like what's going on in Ukraine, that could escalate, would be much more likely than something like the Bay of Pigs or the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we're going to suddenly jump on each other because no one wants to die. So I all I can say, I mean, you can't guess the future. All we can say is talk about the past. In the past, when you ask that question, why did we do this? I mean, we didn't think there was anything more important, and we were on that line that we were paranoid enough to think that this was the only way we were going to keep those Russians from nuking us, and that the moment that they saw weakness, they were going to take that opportunity, and so we had to be that much better than they were. And it is interesting. I mean, for both of these particular episodes, I mean, they were both built around a period when the largest threat was strategic bombers. Before there was a significant threat from submarines and before ICBMs even. And when those changed, then it meant a lot different. I mean, now today, I mean, the thing is, before the bombers get here, we're already going to be dealing with the missiles, and so I mean, their utility kind of faded. But we still operate early warning systems.
Yeah, they look a little different. I mean, we have a much different situation technologically.
Yes,
it is. And maybe this has something to do with the fact that we were on this war footing. They built this really quickly, and I think that when you set out the obstacles, it sure seems like this was going to take a while. But I think, like you said, is that when you think it's the most important thing, and especially after 1949, when we know the Soviets have nuclear weapons and that they're advancing them just like we are, and more quickly than we thought too. That this, not having those a year, taking a year longer to build them could have meant, the difference between the United States and North America existing versus the Soviets. Because boy, you sure don't want to be the person who didn't have a system of warning when the first nukes drop.
Yeah, I mean, if you talk to anybody, I mean, everything was built more quickly then. It seems like there's just more delay process that goes into it today, and obviously they didn't care about environmental impact statements or anything like that because they were able to put the national security in front of it. But when you look at the films, which there's a lot of films in these videos, but when you look at the films, you can see just how much hardware. I mean, we were mothballing hundreds and hundreds of supply ships and military vessels of all sorts. I mean, they were landing this stuff with Higgins boats that we used, prepared for D-Day. I mean, how many of those do we have sitting around because we were preparing to invade Japan? Well, when you've got this is the fleet we were going to use to invade Japan, just sort of sitting around, then then you can invade North Canada and build these sites.
Just fine.
So part of that is because of the war and because of the war footing and because of the material that was left over from the war, and part of that was because of the sense of urgency, and part of that was just it just feels like you could actually get up and do things more in the past, and now construction projects seem to take a much longer delay.
And wouldn't it be interesting? It's interesting that we did that with the Canadians, or we went up there and built that across their land, in inhabitable land that you really couldn't use. But the agreement, or the fact that the Canadians and the Americans actually did that because you're protecting the states rather than Canada, right?
Yeah, well, it was protecting Canada too. That was the war. The war convinced the United States and Canada, because there was a period where it looked like England might fall, and then that was a period when Canada, and to an extent Mexico too, where we all agreed that we would have to cooperate in the defense of North America, and that stuck, and that's what was going on at the time. But that grew over the period of that grew more controversial with time. The fact that U.S. military were in Canadian space until the point where even when you went from the Pine Tree Line to the Mid-Canada Line, the Mid-Canada Line was entirely staffed by Canadians. And that was because there was a kind of a shifting perspective going on. And there was a problem after the war, too, because Canada very quickly wanted to reduce defense spending. So a lot of the original commitments were difficult to keep up with. It was less and less popular in Canada to pay for these sorts of projects. But yeah, in the end, the farther Canada's farther north, they're going to get bombed first. So these are more likely to defend America than Canada.
I also I can see why the average Canadian might look at this and feel like if not for the United States, there wouldn't have been, they wouldn't have been in the path of the nuclear path of nuclear missiles. I can kind of see how they might
after
think
the war,
that, but
Canada saw itself as part of the empire. They certainly saw themselves as part of the
also fair.
Commonwealth. England was attacked first. England was just as worried about. I mean, in terms of the Cold War, was just as worried about the Reds as the U.S. was. So, yeah, I think that did change over time, and I think the two nations have diverged a little bit even since in terms of things like defense and our perspective of the world. But I mean, that grew more and more of a controversy. And then, of course, that became a massive controversy when the question was, how do we clean this stuff up? Because Canada saw that being, more our responsibility than we probably saw it being our responsibility. And it's just as expensive to go do environmental mitigation up there as it was to build up there.
Yeah, I mean, that's always, that's one of the, I mean, it's a common controversy today over whatever we're going to build, whether you're digging a coal mine or building a fuel refinery or whatever you're doing, the costs of the environmental impact cost after the fact, and what you do to fill in the holes and stuff like that. It's always
the toxic. But it also did. I mean, it did what military projects can do. I mean, they talked about when America was in Iceland, they called that a miracle. When America's cooperation with Mexico during the war, they called that a miracle. Yeah, and so really, it built infrastructure where there hadn't been infrastructure. It developed industries in Canada where there hadn't been indigenous industries to do that. Some of those industries are still important industries today. And we talk about at the end. I think we talked about at the end of the Dew Line episode what it meant for indigenous peoples. But I mean, previously, I mean these were people that were almost essentially cut off from civilization. You couldn't bring services to them, and they were still. I mean, it's really interesting to see them landing in their Globemaster, and there's a guy that's showing them his harpoon, right? I mean, and so it did also spark economic development, which has its ups but also its downs, that impacted Canada as well. So it really did change. It changed Canada. It changed Canada's very geography, but it changed its politics. It changed its industry. It changed its economy. And then over time, as the politics changed, then it's led to interesting controversies too. So it's one of those things where you can't disconnect even nature from history, because the two truly do affect each other. And the idea that this historical situation meant that we could go conquer the Arctic in a way we never had before is really extraordinary to think about.
And there were people living up there the whole time. But I think you mentioned in the episode someone saying that there'd been like no one who went from a hunter-gatherer society to modern era so quickly.
So quickly, yeah.
Because otherwise, we weren't building. I mean, you weren't going to build a road to somewhere. Far in the Northwest Territories.
There was very little up there in terms of government or infrastructure or anything, and so the populations up there were still living essentially in hunter-gatherer and to an extent Stone Age, and suddenly you're showing up and building high-tech radar stations up there. They're developing, the skills to help support those stations, but that changes the hunter-gatherer culture, and it did lead to things like sedentary lifestyles, and people had never worried about gaining weight before were suddenly having unhealthy lifestyles and alcoholism and a lot of different things that occurred because you had such a massive and quick change in the culture. But on the other hand, at some point, civilization was going to reach the north of Canada. This allowed them to bring resources, medical resources, and other governmental resources that wouldn't have been up there otherwise. So I don't know. Yeah. I have no idea that if you go up and ask the Inuit in northern Canada if they would prefer to be living like they were prior to the Dew Line, or if they acknowledge that that military spending up there actually did transform in ways that are modern conveniences that people probably don't mind having.
It's a really interesting question, and I guess from our side, it's difficult to really make any judgment on that.
I think probably the answer is probably mixed, and there are probably different people with different opinions.
Yeah, that's kind of what makes sense to me on it too. It does show, as quickly as that was moving, as quickly as it was changing culture, it was also how fast that technology was advancing.
Oh yeah,
because every single one of these lines that we built, by the time we built them, they were already older and less effective
and the next
than
radar
the stuff
had much more capability, and the extraordinary thing about the Dew Line wasn't just the radar; it was that ability to communicate so quickly across with the huge dishes, and it was microwave communication. And one of the things that did is that it dramatically changed how we did radar in commercial aviation. And for a long time, really, the radar at commercial aviation was going to be the one back generation for military. And so that, I mean, imagine what it means in commercial aviation if the best radar you have are like the Mid-Canada line, and they get confused when the birds are migrating. Right. I mean,
yeah.
So I mean, it did that technology change quickly, and part of it was because of the war the idea of the Cold War that it changed quickly, and we were applying resources to it. But those resources did. I mean, radar makes a huge difference in our ability to safely travel today, and our ability to predict weather today, and all sorts of things. And part of that came from this development too. So kind of like the space program. Whenever you're doing that sort of, you throw your national commitment at doing it, which almost always seems to be for defense purposes, then it does. You do get a lot of ancillary technologies that end up having value beyond that military purpose.
And I mean, nowadays, I assume that we've got radar systems that could detect anything coming over the Arctic, but I doubt that they're all. It's not running anything like what the dew line was doing. I don't know what
we
exactly
are
our
able to do
radar
a much
stuff
more
looks
effective
like.
system over much fewer stations. That's what we're able to do now.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting. It's when you look at maps, we always flatten globes on our maps, and so it's so easy to forget that the Arctic is the shortest distance between Canada and Russia.
Yeah.
Because you want to look at like, oh, but there's nothing. It's a different way of thinking to remember that the Arctic sits there just like that. Was it? I mean, at the time, would it have been difficult for the Russians to fly bombers over the Arctic, or were we technologically?
I mean, certainly there's weather in the Arctic. Where do you take off and where you land in the Arctic? But I mean, the thing is, we were operating projects like Operation Chrome Dome, where we were flying B-52s all the time. And we were operating strategic bombers over the Arctic all the time. And so I think that, I mean, certainly the technology, especially with when we moved to, jet bombers, I don't think I think they would have been flying well above weather. So I don't think that was particularly the concern. I think that everybody had the capability to, zip over, the pole if you needed to, But it is funny because we think of ourselves being closest to Russia, like at Alaska or the Aleutian Islands or something like that. But when you actually look at, I mean, Russia and Canada and Alaska are actually very, very close to each other across the pole. Yeah.
Yeah, and when you talk about population centers too, Kamchatka, there's very few people in that eastern side of Russia. And Alaska is very sparsely populated, and so the most sensible way, because shooting them over Europe, of course, we would have all kinds of warning. The most sensible way, and where Russia's going to have most of their nuclear silos, I assume, is going to be ways to shoot over that Arctic as opposed to crossing over the Atlantic or the Pacific. And Europe had their own issues because they were just so much closer.
Yeah.
You could put silos much closer, and they didn't have to travel.
Different kinds of missiles. I mean, that was that's its own story there. I mean, the whole story of the Pershing and so I mean, every place had its, and we had the same thing in Cuba. There was you're using different kinds of missiles when you're shooting between Cuba and Florida. But much of the ICBM strategy, much of the bomber strategy was going to go across because that was just the quickest way and the way that you would give the least warning and so you could literally have been flying your bomber and seeing their bomber going the other direction,
Magellan TV is sponsoring this episode, and they sponsor all of our podcasts. And if you've listened to the podcast, you know that what we like to do is talk about what we've been watching on Magellan TV lately. And so what have you been watching on Magellan TV?
So a lot of things, but we sat down to watch, and we were picking through things, and we came up with one that's called Are There Other Earths? So Magellan is so cool. There's sometimes you got nature, sometimes you got history. We were looking at space, and I was really kind of surprised by it. It's really talking about how we're identifying planets and the new systems we've had. We've got a couple of telescopes that are really just designed to try to identify planets. And it was one of those science ones. It looked like it might have been made for planetariums or something like that, but it really did show a lot of new kind of cutting edge science and a lot of promising ideas of rocky planets that are in Goldilocks zones. And at the very end, the surprising part was they're talking about these nano probes that we're sending, or that we're planning to send. They'll be powered by a laser here on Earth, and they'll be able to make it to like Proxima Centauri in 20 years. Floating piece of metal that's got a little bit of scientific instrument in the middle, and we assume that some number of them are going to, you're going to shoot out like 100 of them, and some number will get knocked out by space dust. And the rest of them within 20 years might be able to get to planets where we'll be able to, get some information back, including photography. It was fun. It was science.
One of the things that I learned, I thought they start talking about as they're tracking all this, and they're tracking them all from planetariums and telescopes that are in Chile. And so I started wondering then why in the world would we build that many in Chile? And it turns out that it says that's the most silent and the clearest, cleanest place that there is in order to build those kind of telescopes. And so they basically are sitting down there in the desert in Chile instead of where you might think that they would be here in the United States or in other places. Yes.
But also at the start, though, they were
Clean air.
highlighting the radar telescope in Puerto Rico that in 2020 that was destroyed because of the hurricane damage.
Oh yeah, that's right.
So I mean, yeah, it was you gotta love Magellan TV and the breadth of things that you can watch. The other day, Mom and my daughter Willow were watching about hummingbirds.
Oh, we learned so much about hummingbirds, and they even have a fake hummingbird that flies among them and checks things out. And so, no, I was absolutely fascinated. And so basically, there's thousands of different kinds of hummingbirds, and it depends on where they live and what kind of flowers there are.
So that's one day you're learning hummingbirds, the next day you're looking for exoplanets. What have you been watching on Magellan TV?
So I watched one called The Funny Side of Science. And I don't know if everyone's heard of these, but there are these things called the Ig Nobels or the Ig Nobles. And they're essentially the idea is that they are supposed to be finding ridiculous science. That one of the Ig Nobel kind of guys, one of the head honchos said at the beginning, he said, it is looking for science that makes you laugh and then makes you think. And it was some really, really interesting stuff. It is the kind of stuff that gets reported on because it's ridiculous, such as apparently if you break pasta, it doesn't break into two pieces. It will always break into more than two pieces. And so there were some guys who were specifically trying to figure out why that is. And so this is science that is all seems a little silly, but what the documentary does is talk about each of these people and about kind of how that science actually has some real world impacts. And because it sounds ridiculous, but then they're like, see, there's actually good reason for us to do this science, even if it's science that's never going to be on the front page for winning a Nobel Prize. Well, at least it can win something interesting, if perhaps not as prestigious. So it's a really, really interesting documentary. It's entertaining. It's called The Funny Side of Science, and you can go from hummingbirds to space to breaking pasta, and you're always learning something. I think that's the great part about Magellan TV. And of course, if you are a listener or watcher of The History Guy, you can always go to try.magellantv.com/historyguy, where we will always have a deal for you. Sometimes a free month, or a deal on an annual membership, or even a documentary that you can watch for free. Again, that's try.magellantv.com/historyguy. Next up, the History Guy talks about the Texas Towers and the tragedy that struck Texas Tower 4.
The technology derived from the economic competition of the Cold War is really quite amazing. From occupied stations 100 miles north of the Arctic Circle to placing a human on the moon, the era really did drive the boundaries of technology and humanity. But not every experiment was a success, and sometimes those victims of the war that was not a war are too easily forgotten. The 28 men who died in the collapse of Texas Tower 4 on January 15th, 1961, deserve to be remembered. After 1953, the air defense strategy of the United States was driven by a military policy of the Eisenhower administration called the New Look. This attempt to balance Cold War military commitments with the nation's financial resources changed the focus of air defense from attempting to protect the nation from attack to providing enough warning to preserve our nuclear attack capability, counting on the doctrine of massive retaliation to deter any attack. This was grounded in the reality of the nuclear age. The former strategy of planning to intercept bombers became essentially futile, as even if we could effectively destroy 99% of an incoming attack, the power of hydrogen bombs meant that an attack would still be devastating. The goal then was to provide our Strategic Air Command with enough warning to allow us to preserve our strategic bombers for a retaliatory strike. There was, therefore, a focus on creating a comprehensive early warning strategy, with significant focus on filling gaps in radar coverage that might be exploited in an incoming attack on the United States. Over the course of the 1950s, the U.S. and Canada jointly worked on a series of land-based installations that would eventually create a multi-layered system of the Pine Tree Line, the Mid-Canada Line, and the Distant Early Warning Line. The development of these systems required massive effort, and each is an engineering marvel in itself. But the lines still included numerous gaps that were expected to be filled via a number of different systems. One of the most extraordinary of those ideas was proposed in a report by MIT's Lincoln Laboratory in 1952. The report considered the possibility of extending radar coverage by building platforms in the Atlantic using offshore drilling technology. They concluded that a set of such platforms equipped with radars could extend coverage several hundred miles offshore, giving half an hour additional warning of a bombing attack. In January of 1954, funding for 5 towers was approved, with the goal of providing an interlocking early warning perimeter stretching from Nova Scotia to New Jersey. Because the platforms would resemble the offshore oil platforms that could be seen in the Gulf of Mexico, they were called Texas Towers. This was quite an engineering challenge. These towers would be substantially larger and placed in substantially deeper water than any oil platform that was operating in that day, and they would be placed in the storm-swept North Atlantic. Originally 5 towers were planned, but only 3 were completed, towers 2, 3, and 4. The towers had to be sizable to fit the radar equipment. The platform was a triangle approximately 200 feet per side and included more than 6,000 tons of steel. And they would be anchored deep. Tower 4 was set in approximately 185 feet of water. Deep-sea oil platforms go much deeper than that today. But in 1954, most oil platforms operated in 20 to 40 feet of water. They worked a difficult balance, trying to present minimum resistance to waves, yet able to withstand hurricane-force storms. Because of their size and the rough seas where they were to be located, they could not be constructed on site. Instead, they were jack-up rigs. Their watertight floating hulls were built in shipyards and towed to their location, where the legs were lowered and the platform raised to its regular height of 83 feet above mean load tide using hydraulic jacks. This created the historical novelty of being the first Air Force stations to be christened and launched from a shipyard. Towers 2 and 3 were built at the Fore River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts. They raised a slight difficulty as the platform had to fit through the gap on the raised Fore River Bridge, where clearance was less than 2.5 feet on either side of the platform. Once constructed, each tower included a large search radar and 2 large height finder radars, each enclosed in a neoprene radome to protect them from the weather, and 3 antennae for communications. The first completed was Texas Tower 2, about 100 miles east of Cape Cod, Massachusetts, in December of 1955. Tower 3, 50 miles southeast of Nantucket, Massachusetts, became operational in November of 1956. The final tower, Tower 4, placed 65 miles southwest of Long Island, New York, became operational in 1958. Of course, the Russians were highly interested in the towers. It was not uncommon to see periscopes from Russian submarines. Russian trawlers, purportedly merchant vessels but probably spy vessels, spent so much time circling the towers that one of the airmen said that at night there were so many lights you thought you were at Coney Island. Rumors spread that the Russians were sneaking onto the platforms at night. The towers were essentially self-contained floating bases. Texas Towers contained bunk rooms, recreational facilities, a library, and a dining hall. But life for the 60 to 100 crews stationed aboard the platforms was not easy. It would have been easy enough in isolated and cramped quarters to get what they call tower fever. The work could be difficult. Supply could only be transferred when the currents cooperated, meaning that airmen would be manhandling heavy deck cargo in the middle of the night, something sailors would usually avoid. But the stations were also seemingly always rocked with noise, not just from station operations, but from the sound transferred up the legs that were anchored to the ocean bottom. They mounted the world's loudest foghorns, which on a foggy day would blow every 29 seconds. In the North Atlantic, fog was common. The Tower 2 foghorn once had to be used for 3 weeks straight. Crews rotated in every 4 weeks found that when they got home, they couldn't sleep without noise. As a sign of the quality of life of the towers, Air Force personnel referred to them as the Iron Bastards. But perhaps the worst of all was the constant motion that was caused by the waves. Tower 2 was said to have a sort of jogging motion. Tower 3 was a twister. Tower 4 in the deepest water was the worst of all, bobbing and weaving so much that the crews referred to Tower 4 as Old Shaky. And that was a warning sign for troubled Tower 4. In June of 1947, as Tower 4 was being towed, 2 structural supports were torn off and lost in rough seas. After the tower was placed, the Air Force decided to install the radar before the supports were fixed. That affected the stability of the station. Tower 4 was in by far the deepest water, over 180 feet, more than 3 times the 56 feet of the water in which Tower 2 was anchored. There was no precedent at the time for anchoring a platform so deep. Then, in September of 1960, Tower 4 was battered by the 50-foot waves and 130-mile winds of Hurricane Donna, a hurricane so powerful that it killed 364 people and caused $900 million in damage. The tower sustained enough damage that it was reduced to a skeleton crew of 14 Air Force personnel and 14 contractors until repairs could be made. They tried to stabilize the tower by filling the legs with sand and concrete. The tower couldn't be abandoned for fear the Russians might capture its sensitive radar equipment. In January of 1961, a strong winter storm with wind speeds up to 80 miles per hour and waves up to 40 feet tall battered the already damaged Texas Tower 4. On January 14, 1961, U.S. Coast Guard Lieutenant Paul Yost recalled, "I remember going to sleep that night with the wind just howling and telling my wife, 'I hope we don't get a call tonight.'" But he and the crew of the 125-foot active class U.S. Coast Guard patrol boat Agassiz did get a call, an emergency call to try to rescue the 24 men aboard Texas Tower 4. The Coast Guardsmen raced through the gale on the 15th, their motto, Semper Paratus, always ready. The winds were too high to attempt a rescue by helicopter. At 6 p.m., the Agassiz was still more than 2 hours out when the tower radioed, "We are breaking up." They were still an hour away at approximately 7:30 p.m. when Tower 4 disappeared from radar. The platform had disintegrated and collapsed into the sea. All 28 of the personnel on the tower died. Only 2 of the bodies were recovered. It was eventually revealed that the Air Force had already decided to decommission the program before the collapse of Tower 4. The advent of nuclear missiles, which moved much faster than bombers, meant that the towers went from adding about an extra half hour of early warning to just 60 seconds. That revelation made the deaths aboard Texas Tower 4 seem all the more futile. The Air Force did add emergency escape launches to Towers 2 and 3 so the crews could get off quickly, but by 1963, those 2 towers were also decommissioned. Tower 3 was salvaged, but Tower 2 was unsalvageable and was demolished on site. After a review board determined that the collapse of Texas Tower 4 was due to human error, a colonel who was the acting commander of the Boston Air Defense Sector was charged with involuntary manslaughter, and 2 other officers were charged with dereliction of duty. The colonel was acquitted in a court-martial, and the charges against the other officers were dropped. In 2003, a study of the collapse of Texas Tower 4 did fault organizational failings, but essentially determined that we lacked the technology at the time to predict the dynamic effects of the tower's design. The study concluded that using modern technology, we could have saved Texas Tower 4. The families of the victims of the collapse of Texas Tower 4 formed the Texas Tower Association and for many years sought official recognition of their family's sacrifice from government. That recognition finally came in February of 2011 when President Obama sent a letter to the association. Donald Abbott, who was the son of Dave Abbott, a welder who died in the collapse, was quoted in the New York Times after receiving the president's letter. "There's not a day that goes by that I don't think about my father. We were pals."
One of the main connections between this episode and the last one, they kind of take place in the same period, almost exactly the same period, over the kind of in the 50s essentially. They were both trying to figure out ways that we could protect the United States and North America from nuclear attack. You mentioned at the beginning of this one the kind of the move into the new look. Which was under Eisenhower, this kind of policy. What kinds of things were changing from like the beginning of us building the Pine Tree Line in like the early 1950s to when we were kind of in the mid 1950s is when we were really fully moved to this new look.
Well,
policy.
Eisenhower became really concerned about the cost of defense. And it was going up and up and up and up. So the new look, the whole idea of the new look was before we were thinking we are going to build, we were thinking like World War II version. So we're going to build enough fighters and enough early warning that if the Russians came with bombers, we were going to be able to go, outfight them in the air and knock them out of the sky. And that we did a lot of things. There were a lot of other things going on here. We were building missiles and things like that too. And there came a point where, first of all, that seemed just futile. Because with hydrogen bombs, when we move from nuclear to thermonuclear, the idea is you only got to get one come through, and you're already killing millions and millions of people. And so this idea that we're going to be able to defend our airspace the way that they fought the Battle of Britain just didn't seem realistic anymore. And the second idea is it was just an expense idea that says so the new look shifted to this idea that said our real goal is just to have enough warning that we can preserve our retaliatory capability. And as long as the Russians didn't believe that they could take us out in one shot, then it would be mutually assured destruction. And of course, that ran into its own challenges too. When we start talking about missile defense under Reagan in the 80s, I mean, it all modifies over time. So that was the idea of the new look. But the new look was really about the services were competing for resources, less so than Canada, but the United States was looking to reduce its defense spending. The guy that used to be the supreme Allied commander was criticizing the military-industrial complex. And so this was, I think, a way to sort of sit around and say, how do we prioritize funds in a way that's much less expensive? And the thinking even at the time really was that we could radically decrease, any thought towards like ground force, because they thought, the next war was going to be fought, with bombs and missiles in the air. And if you could prevent the bombs and missiles, why do you even need tanks and troops? And then, of course, we start getting into the low-intensity conflicts of the Cold War and Vietnam and Korea and then Vietnam. And so, I mean, it was all this sort of rethinking saying, how do we keep up the same idea that we are going to be the superpower, that we're going to maintain, an advance and mutually assured destruction, but not have such a, crippling expense. And that was all changing. I mean, that changed quickly. Thinking changed quickly. Technology changed quickly. As technology changed, that changed thinking. So it's really an interesting and dynamic time. And the funny thing, or an interesting thing about both of these episodes, about the DEW Line and the Texas Towers, is that they really played a very small, short, stopgap version of the war, of the Cold War, and then they were quickly made irrelevant and kind of left behind in the dust. And yet at the time, not just cutting edge technology, but I mean just extraordinary application of engineering and skills to do it.
And interesting enough, in both of these episodes, one of the things that we talked about earlier was what the things that came out of us building the DEW Line up there. And if you think about the technology that went further than when we did the Texas Towers, because an awful lot of that had to have been used when you went in and started harvesting oil. A lot of it's probably used today as we go in and we're putting in the windmills. And so when they're doing the stress and they're trying to figure out how to keep those things together, basically we were headed into a whole new generation there of technology that we didn't have before, and doing it not necessarily for that reason, but we use all of that technology today.
Yeah, I mean, fluid dynamics and the things that we learned from those, and now of course we use that to recover oil from the bottom of the ocean, up in the North Sea.
Yeah. Well, because at the time these were deeper, as you mentioned in the episode, they were deeper than than anything that we actually had getting oil out of like the Gulf of Mexico.
That line, Texas Towers, because they look like the towers that dot all over the Gulf of Mexico. Much deeper ocean and also much rougher ocean and much harsher conditions. And so it's kind of funny that we use that term Texas Towers, because these were really very much on steroids compared to what was going on with the actual Texas Towers. And that developed over time. So there's no question that we were learning things that would be useful in the future. But what we learned from Texas Tower 4 is that we were also putting people at risk when we did that.
Yeah, and it was. They were incredible, these towers, and what we were able to put onto them. Yeah. But it clearly also sounds like we were right at the edge of what kind of technology we could do at the time.
Yeah, we were pressing everything we could to do it. But, it's extraordinary when you think about it. We floated that thing out there like a boat. We launched an Air Force base. We launched an Air Force base from, a dock. Imagine that. And they floated it to a bridge where they had 2.5 feet of clearance on either side. How do you do that? And you drove that out 65 miles from New York City, and you stuck it to the bottom of the ocean. And that is just absolutely, it's amazing to think about today. But to think about that at the time, every bit of that was a new and pressing technology.
Yeah. Yeah, and not perfect, obviously, especially with Tower 4. I did wonder, I don't think you mentioned it any specifically. Do we know why they didn't deploy Towers 1 and 5?
They originally planned 5. The 2 that they did not build were the 2 that were farthest north. And so that was the smallest gap between that and the Pine Tree Line. And those would have been the most expensive to deploy, and it was just a money thing. But I think they also, at the time, where you plan the whole project and they're already realizing that ICBMs are on the horizon and that these might not be all that useful with time. So it just got scaled back. The same reason that we were going to have 30 Zoom waltz and now we're going to have 3.
That is, it's also just much easier at the beginning to be like, yes, this is the big plan, and then to find out once you actually face and things get delayed and money gets spent, suddenly it feels like, just a few is gonna do just fine. I The other thing I was thinking was I cannot imagine living on these things.
Oh,
It kind of sounds
We have
sounds
you know,
like
you think
combining.
of the Cold War as being a Cold War, and then
Yeah.
you realize what troops faced in Vietnam or Korea. But I mean, we those Cold Warriors. I mean, we mentioned that a lot of time here. They were victims of the Cold War. I mean, imagine living up on the dew line. I mean, imagine you're one of those stations with 3 dudes. And,
Yeah, out in the middle of you're only barely in
resupplying. It's,
contact.
5-6 months in between resupply, and just you and those 2 other guys. You better get along. And if that was your brother, you'd be lucky if you came back and there'd only be 1, and the other 2 would be in the refrigerator. So,
We
but I mean,
lost one of 'em on
these
the-
things that the shaking and the wobbling, and the Tower 4 was called the shaky one, whereas the other one was the dancing one, and the foghorns. I mean. The
Oh
foghorns
my
going
gosh.
off all the time. The world's loudest
world's
foghorn
loudest.
is blowing at twice a minute, or day at a time, or unloading supplies on those things, in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that. I mean, now we have essentially huge hotels for oil workers up in the North Sea and stuff like
Yeah.
that. I mean, I think, and I think that in some ways they take those same sorts of risks on a lot of the oil platforms and things like that. But yeah, I mean, it was you were sacrificing for your country, and realize at any given time on the Texas Towers, half of those people weren't Air Force; they were contractors, and so it's I can't imagine. I mean, I appreciate the service of people who sat in missile silos, of people who sat on the dew line, of people who sat in the Texas Towers. We think of maybe that they were just sitting around twiddling their thumbs and looking at Playboy or something, and actually these people were putting their lives and their health on the line for the nation in very dangerous circumstances.
I have to imagine. I mean, you talked about how like they would come home and not be able to sleep without
Without
noise,
the
but I
foghorns,
wonder
yeah.
some of that psychological stuff. I mean, there's got to be some stuff that plenty of them had to carry that with them through.
Yeah, absolutely.
For instance, probably I wouldn't be surprised if they could never get back on a boat. It starts shaking. They're just like, nope.
traumatic, and it had to impact their lives. And and the people
Yeah.
on Operation Chrome Down or stuff like that, there's people that were flying planes
Oh, yeah.
20 hours a day, all the time. And I mean, these Cold Warriors were truly warriors. They were truly taking things out. There were other people were at the base up in Thule in Greenland, right? And so
Yeah.
everybody was taking their challenges. Those would be unique. And you're right. I'm not sure how, if you served your time on those towers, I'm not sure that you ever slept the same again.
Lance and I had the opportunity to go down to see where the Titan
Yeah.
was stored, and it happened that we were there with a man who had served there, and you turned and asked him, did you really believe that this is what you were doing? And he said absolutely. He said every minute you thought it might happen. I might have to shoot this. This is what it does. And so what that would, even him after all those years thinking about it, would certainly make you realize what they sacrificed.
Yeah, this is the Titan Missile Museum. It's south of Tucson, and it's absolutely worth your visit. But I mean, there were people that were sitting in silos, and all day, every day, you might be having to put it into the world, turn a key.
Oh, and you were waiting for that to happen. That was
Yeah.
your job, was to be ready. And some of those
The stress of that had to
there's
be
those stories.
extraordinary. Though honestly,
right?
that was probably better than the foghorns going on every 30 seconds.
Yes.
Well, at least you're not like shaking and then
As far as we know, none
The
of those missile
foghorns.
silos actually sank.
Well,
And
that-
Texas Tower
Yeah.
4.
Yeah.
And at least you weren't, in the water.
although at least one of those we talked about it on an earlier podcast. Somebody dropped a wrench and that
Yeah,
caused
you're
some
right.
significant issues.
Yeah, that pretty much.
So
Yeah, if any of their personal effects that were in there were ruined, that's certainly true. Yeah, that's.
yeah, there's some real challenges but it's also, I mean, you're just in a tight space and high security and all this. It's just a lot of stuff that I think we don't always think about, because you're right. I mean, it's you think about the sacrifices folks were making in combat, and these people were making sacrifices too, and they weren't the same kinds of sacrifices, but it was something that's absolutely worth remembering. As you tell this story, and when you talk about the Texas Tower 4 had like several like things that came off of it that were supposed to, some supports
they
that were
lost some
supposed to help
braces
it,
when
and
they
then
went,
they added
and so it was missing some cross bracing, and that was kind of the conclusion at the end, is that today we could have built a tower that could succeed there, but at the time we just didn't know enough about fluid dynamics and everything that was going on. But it had been damaged in a hurricane, and that hadn't been repaired or hadn't been fully repaired, and I mean it added up.
It does. I mean, it's hard not to wonder if we shouldn't have pulled them off of the tower before we did.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's easy to second guess that kind of stuff, after the fact. That
It is.
I would love
But, I mean,
the story
any
to be
given day
that
they were being circled by Russians, and so they felt like if you pulled them off of there, the Russians would immediately take it over as salvage and be able to get to all sorts of equipment. And so, I mean, they always had these rumors. If you read about there's always rumors about wet footprints and stuff like that. They thought the Russians were sneaking on at night and walking around. And so, I mean, it could.
And
it would
honestly,
be, it
maybe
would be an interesting setting for like a horror movie or something like that, or a science fiction movie. Or what if the Gill Man from the Black Lagoon showed up on your Texas tower? So yes,
those wet footprints
in
were.
retrospect, that they knew it was in trouble. They had largely abandoned the platform. They kept a skeleton crew there. They knew that their life was in danger, and they sent a Coast Guard ship, and they sent it too late. It got there an hour too late. And those 24 men died, or whatever, 28 men was it? 28 men died, I think the ending of that episode where the boy's just thinking about his dad, who was just a welder and who sunk with the Texas Tower, I think it's very poignant. And so yes, certainly, absolutely, in retrospect, we should have abandoned those towers earlier. We should have decommissioned them earlier, and we should have evacuated Texas Tower before it sank. If that Coast Guard cutter had been there an hour earlier, had left just 1 hour more, then they could have evacuated that, and it would have sunk with nobody on it. So the others they added, when you see them, you see in this way it's got like a lifeboat hanging over the side, just like a rowboat. The others they built on the things like you see on ships these days, where they had the launch that would come off of it. But can you imagine the conditions that sank the tower, that you're going to get off in a boat?
Yeah, that was one of the difficulties, is that the tower still wasn't just like the tower fell under. It was just great weather. It was bad weather. That was part of why the Coast Guard couldn't get there in time.
It was a terrible storm. Yeah. So the Coast Guard they go out in anything to try to rescue people, but I mean there was just no time to do it here. So it seems like it must have been an avoidable tragedy, and it certainly is one of those things where we took a risk because we thought it could save the nation, and we knew that people were at risk, and there were things wrong. We shouldn't have had people on there when we didn't have the right supports on it and things like that. I mean, it's really extraordinary to look at the engineering of how they put them up. And actually, I had to kind of pull that back in the episode because I couldn't talk about all of it. How they kind of cranked them up, and it was really it's amazing how you built the whole thing.
Yeah.
But in the end, did they do anything? Did they accomplish anything? Maybe not at all. And for that, we lost those 28 people. We spent an awful lot of money, and all of them are gone now.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Forgotten History, and if you did, you can find more on our website, thehistoryguy.com. We release podcasts every 2 weeks, so stick around if you want to hear more podcasts of Forgotten History. You can also find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Patreon. You can even get a personalized message from the History Guy himself on Cameo.